Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's AOP Live webinar. First of all, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. I'll be joined on stage, as you can see right now, by my co-partner here at Procurement, Kelly Barner. Kelly, thank you for joining us.
Absolutely. Always glad to be here. Thank you for joining us, everybody.
Yeah, so today's session, if you haven't been to an AOP Live before, it's really just all about the conversation. There are no slides. It's all about questions. We have our own questions to submit to and to ask our guest of today, but we always welcome yours. So if you can see within the browser window that you're watching this in, there's a chat. Well, there's a number of icons actually on the side. One of them is a chat, one of them is a Q&A. You can feel free to put any questions that you might have for us, both in the chat session, in the chat window, which we'll be keeping an eye on. We'll also keep an eye on the Q&A as well, if you want to put it there. Q&A I think more private. The chat is for us all to kind of join and jump on and add to. So please feel free to submit questions in that way. Now, today's topic, we've titled it Geopolitical Agility, Future-Proofing for Supply Chain Uncertainty. And Kelly, I think that there's good timing with everything that's happening in the world to be talking about geopolitical agility.
And the good news is this is one of those topics that does not seem to be falling from the headlines. You know, we keep saying it's still above the fold, still above the fold, staying above the fold. So definitely something worth digging in and talking more about.
All right, we're going to be joined on stage by Darshan Deshmukh. Darshan is the president at ProcureAbility. I always love our conversations with Darshan, not to put any pressure on him as he comes on stage, but always action-packed, full of lots of great insight, and I'm sure that today's is going to be no different. So with that said, let's welcome Darshan on stage. There we go, Darshan. The technology works. Fingers crossed.
Yep.
Well, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me, Phil and Kelly. Excited to be here.
Now, to kick things off, the news is obviously very full right now of a lot of disruptive changes. I wonder if you could just share, based on what you're seeing, on the ground, what's the general sentiment in procurement teams that you're working with at the moment?
Sure. So first of all, I think when I think about all the customers that we work with right now, and also attend a lot of procurement conferences in the last couple of months, so there come 2 or 3 key consistent themes. So if I think about divide them into 2 or 3 major buckets, there is general feeling of uncertainty when it comes to what should we be doing. Many organizations, whether it's supply chain, procurement, those leaders are experiencing that anxiety of unknown, right? And I think the next thing is because procurement tends to be very action-oriented organizations, everybody is scrambling to be ready to make sure that they're ready for any surprises that come their way, whether it is some news coming out of White House, whether it's news coming out of trade conversations. Can supply chain react as fast as they can? I think that has been are we ready for that, right? That type of conversation. And I think if I want to take one step below, more on the tactical transactional level, most leaders are focused on, if we do get something disastrous, whether it is war, whether it is really large trade constraints, can we keep our lights on? Can we make sure that we're ready with the tactical items, whether it is supply continuity, whether it is relationships with the supplier, whether it's our ability to get the product and services to our customers? Can we do bare minimum necessary to do those tasks and activities so that we can keep the lights on? I think that has been kind of at the top of most of the leaders' thoughts, because it's really because of the level of change that all of us are going through in the last few months. And I think if I want to kind of take one step further, because we're spending so much energy on this, a lot of the organizations are also feeling the change fatigue of these surprises. And I talked to a lot of leaders in last couple of conferences, and it's almost like organizations and leaders are starting to zone out on the risk anticipation because they just can't anticipate anymore. So I think that also is kind of an interesting sentiment I'm feeling, is it starts with anxiety, it starts with uncertainty, but then also I had enough of this, and I'm just going to see how things come in and I'll try to react to it as fast as I can. So there's like that two ends of the spectrum when it comes to how these organizations and leaders are now thinking about it.
It's really interesting you say about the fatigue around it, because do you see that it's that those feelings differ by geography? And I was, just for context, we talked a little bit off mic beforehand. I was in Canada last week. Sorry, 2 weeks ago, talking about events. And obviously, there's a lot of uncertainty in the Canadian economy. And then you come to the US, and the same, but perhaps not as impacted on a day-to-day basis. Are you seeing that CPOs of all kind of shapes and sizes, if you will, for their organization are feeling those same pains?
Yeah, I got the opportunity to work with pretty much all geographies right now in the last few months, and I also kind of attended a few conferences in Asia, specifically in China, and then also in Europe. And I think geography by geography, it's a little bit different. Within US, I think there is a little bit of anxiety around supply continuity and what does it mean for me from a price and a cost containment perspective. But that is still less than maybe Canada or Europe or Asia. What am I supposed to react to, right? There's a little bit of uncertainty around that, just from a trade perspective. And I think that anxiety is much bigger outside of US. I think when I talk to the leaders. In Asia, I think it's two ends of the spectrum again. If it is like countries that are part of China plus one strategy, whether it's India, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, I think there's a little bit of excitement around it, maybe for lack of right word, because there is a chance to kind of grow those economies a little bit faster. But at the same time, they do also go through a lot of tariffs and other conversations as well, right? So there's a little bit of uncertainty around that, but you see a little bit of kind of mixed bag feelings outside of China. Within China, for sure, there is a lot of anxiety around what does it mean for, and specifically because for JBill, we have a very large presence in China as a supply chain organization. How do you keep yourself ready for the global growth, but then also being able to tackle any of the issues that are coming our way from a trade balance perspective?
Do you feel that in procurement we're seeing the impacts of all these chain of trade, the trade wars, the tariffs, the geopolitical risks that we're talking about today? Are we seeing those impacts today, or are we still kind of waiting for it to? It's like waiting for a train. You can see the headlights, but it's not with us yet. Do you see there's a little bit of we're waiting for the impact of some of the the results of the last 2 or 3 months of uncertainty?
So it's that's a great question, actually. Procurement has always been at the forefront of tackling trade challenges, right? So it's considering most of the organization always focused on like total cost of ownership. So trade challenges were always top of mind for most of the procurement organizations. So collaborating with legal, finance, trade compliance, what the pricing teams are going to do to make sure there is supply continuity, there is price optimization, and then staying ahead of like supply lock-ins when it comes to capacity. I think that's part and parcel of what most organizations did. What is different? The different is the level of change and how fast the uncertainty is getting introduced, right? A lot of these organizations are ready for change, but not the level of change and the severity and the speed at those changes are coming out of these policies. So, and the second piece is, I think as an organization in the last, I would say 20 years, the variables that we need to think about have multiplied significantly. And it's like the complexity of global supply chains, global integrated enterprises, like because we work across the globe. But also the data visibility has improved significantly as the technology and processes matured in the last 20 years. So we also have trained ourselves and also our stakeholders to have all the optionality ready to have a dialogue. So making sure that you have done all the what-if analysis. Have you looked at all the sensitivity analysis of outcomes based on the variables? But when the variables are changing so fast, a lot of times your ability to have that optionality and having a discussion around those optionality tends to be difficult.
Yeah.
So tackling those issues, I think, head on before they become a bigger issue. Yes, the processes and the technology has helped us to become a lot more efficient and effective at it. But at the same time, it's like a game theory of you set the expectations high that you are able to address those quickly. And now when you have so much variability coming in, sometimes you can fall short of it. And then you're kind of then trying to say, okay, can I just react to it every time when the change comes in?
Do you
So,
feel that?
yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Darshan. I didn't mean to jump in.
No, just one last comment. I think I would say, like you asked, like whether we're waiting for it. I would say we're not waiting for the like all the variables, but I think because we are waiting for the way kind of the changes that we need to react to that we can't anticipate good enough. And that frequency of change and that ping pong of the trade strategy, because I think if it's consistent, you can prepare yourself better.
Yeah.
But if it's uncertain and it's new territory, then you can't really prepare for it. And then there is a little bit of a waiting game around that.
And it's hard then, as you say, to build those mitigation plans with not necessarily knowing what the input is going to be.
Yeah,
do you find just on the optionality topic, because it's a topic I've been interested in for a long time, because it feels as though historically we have not necessarily thought about building optionality, whether it's into our category strategies or into our supply selection or anything like that, because there's a cost associated with optionality. And whoever has the most options, kind of bears the most cost of getting those options in place. Do you sense that there's a changing mood in terms of investment in building optionality into supply chains, or it's a nice to have, but when push comes to shove, there's still reticence to put additional dollars behind having optionality?
I think it depends on how critical the category is for your business. Some of the super critical categories where you might be super concentrated in the relationships. I think it's first of all, I think there is a big push towards relationships getting stronger from if it is single source, sole source, doesn't matter what the strategy is. If your optionality is limited by design, how do you mitigate some of these risks jointly? So there is a little bit of a supply relationship management aspect of the conversation with maintaining that. But I think there is also a conversation around, can I create alternate options? And specifically because of the variability within the tariffs and other things, right? So can you actually mitigate some of your risks going forward as part of the strategy? I think that's getting introduced as part of the conversation, but it's not going to happen overnight. I think that's another thing that most organizations struggle with. Like there is a short-term squeeze on the results, but then there is a long-term strategy, right? So how do you reconcile those two elements? Because building like a China plus one as an option for manufacturing, that's going to take years. It's not going to happen overnight. Or when it comes to building optionality for some of your critical suppliers, you most probably have to invest a lot of time and energy making sure that your new supply base is kind of providing the service and the products that you need to kind of for your critical supply base. But I think the procurement organizations are spending a little bit more time critically thinking about, are our small supplier-based strategy or non-optionality option, like if you want to kind of call it, is it worthwhile, or do we want to risk mitigate that in the longer run, having maybe a little bit broader perspective around options?
So is that really as we talk about procurement agility, are some of these strategies what we mean by procurement agility, or are there others that we should be thinking about?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think when you think about procurement agility, I think I can call this as in maybe there are 2 or 3 major things that we should be thinking about. First of all, responsiveness to change, right? We talked about, can we adjust to a new reality as fast as we can?
Yeah.
As we discussed, the amount of variables that we need to respond to have significantly increased by just sheer complexity of the globally integrated supply chains. The expectations from the organizations have become a lot more intense because the visibility of the data has improved, right? So can you actually respond to that change as fast as you can? But at the same time, I would argue sometimes the expectations to the response to like bad data, for example, like you should respond to everything that comes your way. I think that expectation has, like, we have trained ourselves to do that, right? That could create more work than help, actually. So it's important to sort through the noise, making sure that we are responsive to the right priorities and be ready and agile in responding to change as appropriate for the organizations. That's number one. Number two, I would say, do you have an ability to influence extended supply chain?
Yeah.
And when I say extended supply chain, it's like tier 1, tier 2, tier N supply base within your value chain, right? Are you working collaboratively with this extended supply chain in the current environment to tackle any surprises that come your way? It's very rare that the supply chains, whether it's services or product, are delivered through a geographically concentrated area. It's pretty much global delivery across the board.
Yep.
So I think when it comes to that, can we actually relatively work together to respond to these variables? And that your ability to respond to it is directly proportional to how you can influence your supply base in the value chain. And any organization's ability to be agile depends on how you can influence that in a coordinated way. Now that takes us to the next step is how can you do that, right? So to do that, you need to have very strong relationships with your supply base and have an ability to share risk and rewards.
Yeah.
We used to, like, if you think about like 20 years ago, there was always like this, procurement was always considered like a zero-sum game with the suppliers to gain the maximum out of it, right?
I lived that. I lived that life.
That's gone. Yeah, that's gone. And so we need to make sure that we build those strong relationships so you can have a dialogue around, can you share risks and rewards within the kind of integrated supply chain? And if you are able to have those types of relationships when the environment is difficult like what we have right now, you can have a dialogue with all of these trusted partners to figure out how you're going to share some of these risks, how you're going to react to some of these challenges. And in future, whenever the environment is a little bit better, how can you share some of these rewards jointly with each other as well?
Could you give some ideas of what risk and reward mechanisms we could be thinking about with our suppliers? What have you seen be successful?
So I think there are a couple things. So when risk and reward, the biggest thing that I would say organizations struggle with is if you think about what people track supplier performance on, right? It's generally like 3 or 4 major dimensions. And that's what traditional SL is, right? Whether it's within time, within budget, with quality, right? So if I want to kind of put it into like a simple terms. That's table stakes. I think when it comes to these relationships, can you actually work with the supply base to figure out what innovative ideas that you're going to kind of drive as a joint organization so that you can tackle some of these challenges in the longer run? And can you actually track that as part of the investments that these suppliers are making, as part of the actions that they are driving with their tiered suppliers? Can you actually track that and have a dialogue with your supply base to drive that, right? So, and I think that's going to drive a very different conversation around what risks you're taking, what risk you're sharing, but then also what rewards you might be getting ready for. And for that, there needs to be very clear sharing of information across the organization. I think, again, if you hold your information and other parties also holding information back, there is always a game theory around anticipation. And how do you avoid that as part of that risk-reward aspect of the conversation with your partner? And how trusted that relationship is depends on also how you share information with each other. And I think that also is like another critical part on the transparency part. Can you actually drive that transparency within the relationship as well?
Because if there's going to be resources around to give rewards, right? We don't always necessarily talk about, pushing on savings as like the primary objective in all cases, but it's still always going to be part of the conversation. And so now you've got this situation where everybody's trying to run as cost effectively as they can with all this uncertainty and all these disruptions, but you're still trying to sort of carve out some of those savings so that there are rewards to be divvied up.
Mhm.
Are you seeing any mindset shifts on procurement's side around, how they're looking at savings or how they're factoring supplier performance into trying to achieve those savings? Or is it still sort of the traditional, we're looking to reduce costs in certain ways while holding quality fixed? We're just doing it in a more complicated situation.
Kelly, that's a great question, I think, and kind of just the theme in general. But I would say this is one of the most challenging environments for procurement because of the uncertainty and issues associated with how do you manage these relationships in the longer run, right? The efficiency in savings delivery, that's always part of the conversation. But when you have an environment like what we are in right now, there is a cost escalation in the products and services. So first of all, you need to make sure that you analyze it and figure out how much of it is real, how much of that is kind of pushing risk from one party to another party, and how are we having those conversations with your supply base, right? There could be a tendency to over-rotate on this. So there could be companies, they could range from like a traditional aggressive way of beating the partner up for results type of an approach, or it could be over-the-top risk coverage by making sure that you are being super conservative in how you plan, right? So you're trying to game the system in the decision-making. But as all of us know, like it's really when both of those are not that effective, because when it comes to kind of creating a consistency within the supply chain, both of these approaches actually create a bullwhip effect within the supply chain, right? Whether it's cost containment, whether it is supply commitments, whether it is relationship management, because we're taking a very like a tempting view of cost containment within these environments, right? So like we're seeing a lot of like the strategic sourcing category management professionals are taking a long view around this. And then that long view, like if you think about it, the role of a category manager becomes more of a procurement business partner on both internally and externally. Do you actually understand what the priorities are from the business standpoint, like internally, from your stakeholders, and building that relationship and making sure that you are reacting to your customer needs? And then do you have a business partner relationship with the supplier, more of a traditional SRM role, where you are taking into consideration what sort of gives and takes that you are working with your supply base, right? The challenge in this environment is all of the organizations are going to go through the same cycle at the same time. So how do you figure out the risk reward mechanism for each other, making sure that you are giving something to also receive some of these benefits as part of it? And a lot of times I see that as more of a supply commit and ability to grow the revenue with the supply base. I think that tends to be one of the big levers that most of the category managers use. Now, that depends on what sort of business you are in. If the business is growing, that's an easier conversation with the supplier. If the business is not growing, like being able to commit to maintaining the business with the supplier is also enough leverage to have that conversation from a savings of the kind of sharing of the savings, sharing of the financial results as part of that. But I think ultimately, the goal we should be striving for is try to avoid the game theory in decision making, because that creates a very high stress within the supply chain. So like all of us talk about like beer game that we kind of do it in schools, right? But it's real. Like it's really every single relationship, when the transparency doesn't exist, you get into this game theory of like how you're going to drive or how you're going to tackle the response from the other party, and trying to anticipate that and kind of plan for it. It's a lot more inefficient way of tackling an issue, versus being able to provide the transparency in this environment is critical. And then driving that mutual level of trust in the relationship will drive the optimal results within the given constraints.
Yeah, and with no trust, there's no ability to build on supplier relationship management, as we talked about, as one of the key kind of mitigation factors. When it comes to risk itself, we've talked a lot about risk. I'm interested in digging into something you said right at the beginning around fatigue, around risk management. But before I do that, I wanted to ask, as we think about risk itself, is there a difference between perceived risks and what the real risks actually are? And how do we kind of ferret those out?
Yeah, absolutely. And the answer is there is a difference between real risk and kind of actual risk, because every time when a change comes in, the human nature is generally panic, right? And especially when it's unanticipated level of change that we are experiencing right now. So the organization, and depending on how you train your organization as well, some organizations are very adrenaline rushed, like trying to react to every change that is coming alongside. So there is a need to assess that real risk versus a perceived risk when the risk is introduced, right? So we should look at various dimensions of risks first. So that includes, and if I want to kind of make it into like simple risk profile, whether it has a cost risk, whether it has a supply continuity risk, whether it has a supply commit risks from the supply base. Does it have a cost transfer risk across the extended supply chain? Does it have customer retention risk? Does it have a relationship across your supply chain? Or does it create an internal risk within your own organization from maintaining your customer base, maintaining your organizational sanity, maintaining your ability to continue to build? Like all of these dimensions need to be kind of looked at with a very kind of a objective view. And in that environment, like as humans, we have a tendency to really look at it with a single dimension of short-term results. So that also adds another dimension to it, is like you have to look at all these dimensions, but then also have a short-term view and a long-term view. So when you look at these decisions and when you take the decisions, there might be different impacts to a short-term and a long-term. So it's important to do a diagnostic around that real risk and the hypothesis and variables, and do the sensitivity around responding to these risks. So I'll use an example. So at Jabil, we're part of Jabil. We look Resilience Hub to assess real risks in real time. So it has multiple dimensions. It's a generative AI platform that we have built internally because we are contract manufacturing firm that's across the globe. So it has hundreds of risks that we need to look at as part of that. So our Resilience Hub actually looks at all of these variables in real time. It does a bunch of predictive analytics based on the Gen AI and the trends that we are seeing on the variables, and being able to combine that with the inputs from the risk profile perspective and coming up with a recommendation on what you should be looking at, right? And then you add that to more of a human-centered approach. So not everything it's going to be recommendations. You kind of look at those hypotheses and recommendations against the reality and put in the human-centered approach to it, and then figure out what decisions you want to make sure that you're ready for that risk profile within that industry as well. So we work internally with that, but then we also work with some of the other industry players that some of our customers are. So that drives that real-time, real risk versus perceived risk, and can you actually take the noise out of the overall decision making?
So is that, and what you've built sounds quite advanced, and also an insight into the art of the possible as we think about using generative AI from a risk management perspective. Does that require, are you doing an assessment up front to say, well, based on all these different factors I should focus on, let's just put numbers out of the air. I have 10,000 suppliers. I know I need to really focus on these 100. And then I'm doing that kind of ongoing monitoring on those 100. Or are you doing it on the whole 10,000 and saying, well, as events change, that's going to change the inherent risk profile with each supplier and maybe driving different actions so that I'm not at risk of missing something in the supply chain that is not just limited to these 100 suppliers that I've determined. Those are the ones I'm going to keep an eye on.
That's again a great question. So it's a various versions of the risk profile. So we look at the risk profile across the whole supply base, but it's at varying degrees. Yeah. So the top 100 suppliers that are very critical for your operations, the dimensions of the risk profile are a lot more comprehensive as compared to the bigger risk profile for the smaller supplier base.
Yeah.
And it's by design, and it's like the efficiency and how much, like you don't want to have analysis paralysis as well, right?
No,
So
and you
want to
can't
make
manage
sure.
all risks at all time, which I think is one of the fundamentals of risk management. Really, you've got to know where to focus.
Yeah, absolutely. But we look at the whole, because the platform enables having information available as fast as it could be. We have an ability to look at the whole supply base, but it kind of focuses on like key major 5 to 10 risk profile elements across the whole supply chain to make sure that we are not missing on the key risk indicators across the extended supply chain. But with the 100 odd, it's a little bit more than 100. I think it's around 150, 160
Yeah.
suppliers that we look at and make sure that we have a really comprehensive risk profile built out and being able to tackle that.
We've spent a long time in procurement building up a value proposition that goes beyond savings, that goes beyond risk management as well, and it brings in levers like sustainability, managing Scope 3 initiatives, and emissions. Are you seeing a diversion of focus away from the other value generators that we can bring in procurement to the savings and the risk management, back to kind of basics? Or is it important that you kind of keep your eyes on staying committed to some of these others that may be a little bit easier to disregard because there's focus in other areas, but to make sure that we continue to kind of build that into the value proposition and the activities that we're doing?
So I think this is basically a long game versus short game, right? In the longer run, sustainability agenda doesn't change. It's important to maintain sustainability as part of your overall strategy. It might feel difficult in the current environment, and sometimes even impossible, right? Considering some of the politicizing of that issue. But the organizations that decide to part ways with that agenda will be at disadvantage, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And will need to catch up if they choose to do it in future. And it's not just about cost. It's all about and it's not philosophical, but I think it's real. And it's all about how the world operates in the longer run, so that we and our future generations have safer and livable environment available, right? So I don't think it's optional for most organizations. I think this agenda gets politicized because of the polarity of the political landscape. But we're not seeing big organizations changing the sustainability agenda. Maybe how you message it within your organization might be a little bit toned down. But in the longer run, I think the actions that are in place for Scope 2, Scope 3, depending on the organization that you're in, I think those actions still go on. It might have slowed down a little bit, but I don't think that's an option when it comes to overall commitment towards sustainability, especially on the larger and the medium scale organizations.
Darshan, I actually want to go back and ask you about a phrase that you used before, and I jotted it down, but I know I'm not going to forget it. You talked about organizational sanity. So first of all, if you figure out how to bottle that, we'll all take a case, right? Because there's been so much going on. And when I think about the complexity that we're facing, I think there's probably two different ways connected to that idea to look at it. We could say, okay, things are really hard. Let's go back to what we know and what we do best and stick to the fundamentals, right? But then there's also this idea that insanity is doing the same thing and expecting different results, right? So if we think about that, does strategic sourcing remain as effective in these business conditions as it has been? Because to me, if there's any fundamental procurement's going to turn back to, it's going to be some portion or segment of strategic sourcing, because it's sort of like history, external, internal, formal decision-making process. But is it still effective given the conditions we're working in today?
That's a great question, Kelly. I think it's important to have strategic sourcing. I think if we ask various organizations what they think about, what do they think about from a tasks perspective when they think about strategic sourcing, right? There will be an overwhelming number of organizations think about the transactional nature of sourcing. And when I say transactional, not in the tasks perspective, but really it's a execution activity, right? Like running an RFP, running reverse auction as strategic sourcing. And I think that's where I think I would call that as actually more tactical activity. And in the current environment, that's not going to yield results. I think it needs to have like that traditional category management, relationship based, kind of driven strategic sourcing, and then using of the technology to drive the decision support to deliver results, right? So if you use all of those together, strategic sourcing is still relevant. But I think if you look at like the whole value chain and the task metrics across the value chain for procurement, all of these things are included in it. But I think most of the organizations only do like that middle section of execution and keep on running strategic sourcing in quotes as like RFPs. I think that's most probably is going away in a way, maybe when you think about it. And I can use maybe a little bit of a example. So like organizations are accelerating time to market when you think about RFPs, right? Using technology, using tools, and then being able to exercise your competitiveness within the marketplace to drive the value, right? So that's more transactional aspect of the strategic sourcing. But I think organizations are starting to become a lot more creative to say, okay, how do I drive value out of it? So I can use maybe one example with one of the clients that we work with is a high-tech customer, and they were going through relooking at how do I want to think about my procurement process. And they went all the way up to thinking that I want to drive an innovative approach in pushing the strategic intent for the organization. So I'm going to look at my value chain, and I'm going to say all of the strategic sourcing should be done by a self-service model. So I want to build the strategies that we don't want procurement team to run RFPs and do traditional tactical sourcing. We want to focus on setting the strategy, build the relationship, build category management framework so that all the execution is done in a self-service mode. Now, that's the ultimate vision. The results are going to be somewhere in the middle as you're kind of building that up. But I think what that did is really it built a very small shared services organization that helped the large organization in running these kind of transactional nature of the strategic sourcing. Yeah. But it forced the organization to focus on the right things, right? Because incentives drive behavior. So they took like that polarizing approach to say, okay, I don't want to do strategic sourcing. I just want to build the strategy and make strategic sourcing self-service. How can I do that? Right. So that's like the design point, and then they build the processes and technology platform and organization around that. So
and I think what
it's still relevant, but making sure that we take a very intentional approach to supply relationship management and category management along with it.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting too, because this also connects to a conversation I know we had last year, right? We were talking about AI and use cases, and now we've got all of these external complexities and uncertainties. And so it's not just looking at the sourcing process and saying, okay, how many steps am I going to have, or how far beyond the RFP am I going to go? It's saying, how do I actually want to change the procurement operating model that I have in place? What is it that procurement is going to do strategically and tactically and operationally? And then how does that change our staffing? Are you seeing organizations start to adjust, where procurement spends time, what they prioritize, what skills that means they need in-house? Is it actually getting to the point where, AI plus complexity is starting to change the landscape of how procurement operates?
I think the answer is absolutely. Like the level of change depends on how mature your organization is in adopting some of the AI aspect of the platforms and the technology.
Yeah.
I think what is changing is the roles are becoming a lot more about procurement business. We call it like procurement business partner role, right?
Yeah.
So it's really relationship building, making sure that you are building the pipeline, you are building the decision support system, you are making sure that you're capturing the demand and supply as part of your overall process and driving the value. It's less about doing the busy work as fast as I could and drive and squeezing the value out of it.
Yeah.
Right? So it's not about I want to do 100 RFPs and take as much spend under management as possible. That's, I think, the old school kind of the organizational design in general. I think what we're seeing is everybody's thinking about, I'm going to maximize my throughput by using of technology, AI, and Gen AI, whatever call it, like building the platform ecosystem in such a way that you accelerate that execution aspect of the procurement, but then spend a lot of your energy around upfront work on the relationship building, making sure that you are a good decision support system to validate some of the technology efficiency that you're bringing in. And then I think going maybe a little bit one step further is work closely with some of your business partners internally, like including sales, to manage any fluctuations and surprises in the most proactive way that we traditionally didn't do a great job at. I think it was always, we did a great job in managing the supply base, but managing the customer side of the business so that you can be a revenue generating or revenue enabling organization as a procurement organization, that was always one of our weak spots, right? And that's also changing. So I think the skill set on both, basically from a procurement standpoint, that business partner relationship, both on the customer side and also on the supplier side, is going to be very critical. And I think the third piece, I think we talked about it last year, is somebody that is very comfortable with change. Because things are going to change at a very fast pace. So we started with change and how our inputs changed. But this is more around when you go through the technology change that we're going through, that also introduces another big dimensions on how comfortable you are in keeping up with that change, right? And being comfortable with it is going to be very critical from a skill set perspective.
I think that you mentioned sales is interesting because when you were talking about sort of the business partnering and thinking about procurement's operating model changing and our role changing, I'm thinking, great. Now we have to get everybody else to adjust to these changes we want to make, even if they're good for everybody. Nobody likes that, right? We're trying to win people over. But you're reminding us that no, in the past, most procurement teams have not had proactive, two-way, fully engaged relationships with sales. It might actually be easier to go find some new ground, right? And prove how that can work and then start to let that flow back into other parts of the organization. Because sales is probably a very natural and effective spreader of message, right? If they have a successful partnership with procurement and we're able to help them achieve something, we don't need to communicate that internally. I mean, we can, but they're going to spread the word like lightning.
Absolutely. And I think this is where I would say we always, when the procurement teams put together category strategies or category plans, right? They always work with the stakeholders and the business partners on the revenue side to build the overall plan. But I think the whole financial interlock process around, okay, what is your commitment towards delivering to the P&L or making sure that the business actually captures the value that you created? That was always a little bit of a softer and hit and miss results with based on depending on the stakeholder group, right? So I would say like that relationship building on the sales side, where you actually are like in the joint seat with your sales organization to build what your overall cost structure looks like, to build what your supplier development looks like, to build what risks you're taking as part of your overall delivery model. Like all of these conversations, educating them as an organization and taking that ownership as a supplier relationship manager, I think the businesses would react, or the revenue side of the business would react really well to that as part of the conversation. And it's less friction around, oh, did you actually deliver the savings? I didn't see it, right? I just used it up for something else, right? Those types of dialogues are going to be less and less. I think it's going to be more around how do you enable my revenue generating activities, and how can you help me hit my P&L goals as part of the procurement, as part of the business unit. I think that becomes like an interesting conversation, and I think it will continue to get mature and mature.
What's then the corresponding sort of next step or expanded role around partnering when we talk about suppliers? I mean, interesting, we're talking about partnering internally with sales. It's even a shorter step in some ways to go from partnering internally with sales to externally with somebody else's sales team, right? Because at that point, it's sort of same mindset, same sort of deliverable. But how might we think about, given the need for agility and the complexity and all the things we're trying to deliver, carrying that out with our most key or strategic supply partners?
And this is a very interesting dynamic, right? So if you think about And we are a services organization within JBL, but we are part of supply chain organization. We report up to the chief supply chain officer. So he has around 3,000 professionals specifically focused on supply chain, right? And most of those relationships tend to be on the selling side of the supplier, right? So if you think about the category directors or the category managers that are managing specific categories, their relationships tend to be with the sellers on the supplier side, right?
Yeah.
But the actual delivery is done by the supply chain organization within the supplier side, right? So how do you continue to build? So you have the commercial relationship with the selling organization, and then you have an operational relationship with the supply chain organizations internally, and managing both of those dimensions as a relationship manager becomes very critical, right? So it comes to, when it comes to kind of expanding your comfort level, so it's not just about I'm managing a commercial relationship with a supplier, but it's also an operational relationship to enable them to deliver what you're looking for from a supply chain and operations perspective, and collaborating with that internal supply chain organization on the supplier side also becomes very critical as a customer, right? I think you're very comfortable doing that as like your own supply chain organization, but how do you drive that influencing skill with the supply chain organization on the supplier side also becomes very critical.
Now, with as we think about agility and responding to agility, we've just talked about relationships with other functions and with internal teams. Are you finding that the need for agility and to build the optionality we talked about right at the beginning is driving closer collaboration, or requires closer collaboration between procurement and folks within the business, whether that's engineering, whether it's the budget holders, if it's in the indirect procurement space, that we will struggle to deliver on our ability to be agile without it?
Yeah. So the answer is absolutely yes. I think that extended supply chain visibility is very critical. It's very critical to have that collaboration with engineering. It's very critical to have that collaboration with your supply demand planning team. It's very critical to have a relationship with your sales forecasting team, right?
Mm-hmm.
Being able to have the true input into what that looks like, right? Traditionally, if you think about the traditional S&OP processes, they used to kind of carry like this black box model. Oh, I have a demand A that translates into a bill of material, that translates into the next bill of material, and it just kind of cascaded through the supply chain. But it was like back and forth, like as a supply commit process, right? But I think it's with the new relationship model and the new extended supply chain model, that visibility is instantaneous. Mm-hmm. That transparency is very critical. So how do you avoid some of that maybe mistrust in this process, so that you are trying to maintain the inventory to meet your demands and other things? Can you actually have transparency across this multi-tier supply chain? And I think that's very critical from a relationship perspective internally within your organization. So when you build the program around, like specifically around the SRM program, build the long-term and short-term incentives for the partnership.
Mm-hmm.
I think when things get tough, rather than competing for positives, can both parties look at it as a joint lens to optimize the results for the extended supply chain?
Yeah.
Otherwise, I think you are kind of optimizing for your own organization. Yeah. But can you actually look at it as a joint lens, and can you take the right action? And if you can do that with your internal partners and also with suppliers, that collaboration will definitely help sharing risks and rewards depending on the environment that you are in.
So definitely placing kind of intentional focus on this not being a zero-sum game, as we talked again with any of the relationships and partnerships that you had. And as we look at kind of the three areas we set out at the beginning around agility, we talked about change responsiveness, the ability to influence the extended supply chain, and really those strong relationships and strong partnerships with supplier. I do want to go, before we start to wrap up, back to that change responsiveness, because you said something right at the very beginning, which piqued my interest, which was around fatigue and change fatigue, and perhaps risk fatigue. what are some signs of that to look out for? If leaders listening today and they're thinking, okay, what do I need to be observing and aware of if we're starting to get fatigued around risk management, and perhaps any tips you might share on how to nip that in the bud?
Sure. I think so. Maybe I can use an example and a use case around this to answer this. So we built a risk program for one of our financial services clients, and they had their traditional compliance program around risk.
Yeah.
Right. So when you look at like the checklist had 175 questions when they're building the risk profile for a supplier, or when they onboarded a supplier. When we went through it, like we went through a very fine-tooth comb approach of how much of this is truly regulatory compliance question, or is it really our anticipation on what is absolutely necessary, right? So the way we approached it is like when we went through the questionnaire, we used that 5 times why approach, where like let's ask 5 times why. Why do we need this question? And then until it passes that filter, let's try to rationalize the questions. And we are able to kind of reduce the questions into half, basically, by doing that. It's still a lot, but I think in the financial services industry, that was kind of one of the key aspect of risk management is regulatory concerns drive a lot of these kind of risk fatigue type of actions, right? But then what it was missing is the long-term questions around risk. So we added a few questions that were more long-term relationship focused, that were more innovation, readiness for future, readiness for technology, right? All of those were not part of that initial 175 questions. So we introduced some of those as part of the overall risk profile. Now it became a little bit of a well-rounded risk profile. So what I would recommend is if you feel your risk program is a lot more transactional / tactical in nature, that is focused more on compliance, relook at that and make sure that you go through every question critically to ask yourself, do you really need this question? Or are you truly assessing a risk here, or is this just somebody's interpretation of what that risk is, right? And do a joint exercise. It's not just single lens, maybe 3 or 4 stakeholders, making sure that you have your legal team as part of the conversations, and then continue to optimize that as you kind of go along.
I smiled as you started to give that example because I worked in a financial services company building a supplier risk program. And it's very easy to add questions that are nice to haves. You're using the risk assessment questionnaire as an excuse to put questions in front of suppliers that they may not otherwise ask, or may not otherwise give you information on. That creates more burden for filling it out under the guise of, well, they've got to complete this. So I think that's really good guidance. Now, we're about to wrap up with a final question. Before I do, I just want to remind anybody who's enjoyed this conversation so far, would like to get more insights from Darshan and Darshan's team at ProcureAbility. There is a couple of links that we have that are rotating in the chat box that you see on the site to go and view the ProcureAbility LinkedIn page and subscribe to the LinkedIn page, and also to subscribe to ProcureAbility's Insights newsletter. So please do go ahead and do that. You see the 2 links in the chat. Always a lot of great insights coming out of the ProcureAbility team, as we're seeing today in our conversation. Now, as you go and do those and click those links, I'll ask you, Darshan, the last question, just to really wrap up on today's conversation that we've had. What's a piece of advice or a takeaway that you want our audience to leave today when it comes to that topic of geopolitical uncertainty and managing agility around that for procurement?
Yes, I think it's simple. Play the long game. Avoid myopic thinking and approaches to solve like immediate problem as much as you can. And I think to do that, I would say a simple way to do that is simple but hard, is treat your suppliers as your customers or clients. And I think that's a very, and that this was like one of the slogans that we have internally within Jabil. The chief supply chain officer talks about this all the time. I think that changes our dynamic. Like if you treat your suppliers like that you would treat your customers or clients, it definitely changes the way you think about the relationship. And that's also going to drive a very different behavior when it comes to managing the risks and the disruption going forward as well.
No, okay, that's a great piece of advice, and 100% agree with that. I've seen in CPG companies, for example, consumer product organizations that truly do look at each one of their suppliers as if they are customers, because often they are their customers. And it changes everything from the mindset of how you work with them to the language that you use as well. Because you become a point of a brand representation of your organization with your customers. So great advice as always. Well, Darshan, I want to thank you so much for joining us for today's AOP Live. Kelly as well, thank you for helping me pose the questions to Darshan, and for everybody who joined us today and watched in. If you have colleagues that you think may be interested as well, you can always go back. The registration link will still be live. You can go and watch again. And again, those two links, check out the ProcureAbility LinkedIn page, but also the ProcureAbility Insights newsletter for more information. So with that said, thank you so much, Darshan.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot, everybody. Take care, and we will see you again soon on another AOP Live.